Imagine waking up and discovering that half your neighbors have died overnight. Not from war, not from famine, but from a disease no one understands, that kills in 3 days and spreads faster than you can run. Now imagine this happens every day for 2 years straight, until 9 out of every 10 people in your town simply disappear. This isn't fiction. In 541 AD, humanity faced its first global pandemic, and it was so brutal that it nearly wiped civilization off the map. If you think you survived COVID, wait until you find out why not even the most powerful emperors in history escaped Justinian's plague. Because this wasn't just a disease, it was the end of the ancient world. But before I tell you about this bacterial apocalypse that killed more people than all the wars in ancient history combined, you need to understand what it was really like to live at the height of the Byzantine Empire in 541. Constantinople was the New York of the 6th century, the largest city in the world, with 500,000 inhabitants crammed into a peninsula, surrounded by impenetrable walls. The streets teemed with Arab merchants, Germanic soldiers, Greek artisans, and slaves from across the Mediterranean. Dozens of different languages echoed through the markets. It was the center of the known universe. Silk from China, spices from India, gold from Africa, everything passed through Constantinople. The Hippodrome welcomed 100,000 people screaming at chariot races. The public baths were open 24 hours a day. Marble palaces rivaled gilded churches in height. And at the center of it all was Justinian, the emperor who dreamed of reconquering Rome and restoring the glory of the ancient empire. Their armies were reconquering Italy. Their fleets dominated the Mediterranean. Their engineers were building the Hagia Sophia, the largest cathedral ever seen by humanity. The people felt invincible, protected by God, by the most advanced technology of the time, by walls that had never been breached. Byzantine medicine was the most sophisticated in the world. Doctors who studied Galen and Hippocrates organized hospitals, treatments that worked. Do you know what the biggest concern of the common citizen of Constantinople was that autumn of 541? Whether the blue team or the green team would win the next race at the Hippodrome. People fought in the streets over horse racing. This was the crisis of the time. What deadly irony. The most powerful, richest, and most protected city in the world was about to become the epicenter of the greatest health catastrophe in human history. And it all started with rats on ships from Egypt. But no one heeded the signs until it was too late, because in 541, strange deaths within the empire were only distant news. I'll tell you something that should have sent everyone into a panic. Months before the plague reached Constantinople, merchants began bringing disturbing reports from the port of Pelusium in the Nile Delta. People are dying of a strange fever, they said. Black swellings appear overnight. But do you know what the reaction was? Total indifference. Pelusium was over 1,000 kilometers away. It was just another one of those tropical diseases that always appeared in Egypt. Nothing that could cross the Mediterranean and threaten the capital of the civilized world. The first fatal mistake was underestimating its speed. Within 3 months, the disease jumped from Pelusium to Alexandria, the second largest city in the empire. Within another 2 months, it reached Antioch in northern Syria. And then something incredibly frightening happened. The disease began to follow the trade routes precisely. Every ship leaving Egypt carrying wheat to feed Constantinople carried, with it, invisible passengers, rats infected with fleas carrying a bacteria no one could see. Yersinia pestis, the same plague that would cause the Black Death 800 years later. But here's the cruelest detail. The symptoms were completely unknown to medicine at the time. Byzantine doctors knew how to treat fractures, heal war wounds, and even perform complex surgeries. But this was something they'd never seen before. First came the high fever, normal they thought, then the violent chills, still normal. But on the second day, buboes appeared. Egg-sized swellings in the armpits, groin, and neck. Black, hard, and painful to the touch. The doctors had no idea what they were, and then came the most terrifying part. The person always died within 72 hours. It didn't matter if they were young or old, rich or poor, strong or weak. 3 days was the longest anyone lasted. After the first symptoms in the spring of 542, Merchant ships began arriving in Constantinople with reduced crews. Some arrived with half the sailors dead, others with only the captain alive. The ship arrived completely empty. Yellow brought it to port, but still no one connected the dots. And it was precisely this fatal blindness that transformed the first isolated cases into an explosion of death that consumed the entire empire. The first official case in Constantinople was recorded one morning in May 542. A 35-year-old port stevedore, Mekei, arrived home complaining of a headache. The next day he couldn't get out of bed. On the third day his wife screamed in the streets for help. The doctor who came to examine him collapsed. He had never seen anything like it. Black buboes had sprouted overnight in the man's armpits. A fever so high it burned to the touch, violent delirium and a sweet putrid smell that permeated the room. Mekei died that afternoon, and here lies the first crucial mistake. No one isolated the family. The wife continued going to the market. The children continued playing in the street. Neighbors continued visiting to check on him. Within a week, 7 people from the same block were dead. But do you know what's most shockingly cruel? Even when cases began to multiply, the Byzantine authorities believed they could contain it. After all, they were the Byzantine Empire. They had the best doctors, the best organization, the best administrative structure in the world. The city's mayor ordered the bodies buried quickly, unaware that fleas from the dead jumped onto the living during funerals. Imperial physicians created sanitary cordons around the affected neighborhoods, unaware that rats crossed these cordons every night. And then came the second fatal mistake: imperial pride. When envoys from smaller cities arrived begging for medical help, reporting that entire villages were dying, the response was always the same: send the sick to Constantinople. Our doctors know how to treat this. They were literally importing the plague into the heart of the empire. In June, 100 people were dying a day. In July, 500. And then, one August morning, something happened that chilled even Emperor Justinian himself. They discovered that the rats were dying before the people. Thousands of dead rats appeared in the streets overnight, and the few doctors still alive understood a terrifying truth. If even the rats couldn't survive, what chance did humanity have? It was the last warning before the true hell began. And when it began in September 542, death became so common that people stopped mourning the dead. I'll explain exactly how Justinian's plague killed and why you had absolutely no chance of surviving. The first day, you'd wake up with a headache. That felt like someone was hammering inside your skull. Fever. That made you shiver even in the Mediterranean heat of September. You'd think, it's just a bad cold. You'd keep working, talking to people, touching objects, spreading death without knowing it. On the second day, the fever would rise to 104 degrees, violent vomiting, diarrhea that would leave you dehydrated within hours. And then the buboes would appear, swellings the size of oranges that would sprout in the armpits, groin and neck, hard as stone, black as coal, painful as live coals. When you saw the buboes, you'd know. Everyone knew. It was a death sentence. Day 3, hallucinatory delusions. People screamed the names of dead relatives, talked to ghosts, tried to run naked through the streets. Their skin would turn purple. Their breath smelled of rotting flesh. And then, almost always at sunset on the third day, their heart would simply stop. 72 hours. That was how long it took from the first headache to death. But here's what makes this plague more brutal than anything we know today. It didn't choose victims. COVID kills more elderly people. Cancer attacks specific cells. Accidents spare the cautious. Justinian's plague killed 2-year-olds and 20-year-old soldiers. It killed malnourished beggars and well-fed empresses. It killed experienced doctors and illiterate peasants. And do you know what the most desperate part was? There was absolutely nothing you could do. Nothing. Byzantine doctors tried bloodletting, purgatives, cold baths, hot baths, herbs, prayers, amulets. Nothing worked. The mortality rate was 95%. 95%. If 100 people caught the plague, 95 died. The 5 who survived were marked forever, blind, deaf, or with paralyzed limbs. In October 542, 5,000 people were dying every day in Constantinople. 5,000. In a city of 500,000, this meant that every 100 days the entire population died, replaced by desperate refugees from smaller cities who also came to die. And then came the news that sent even Justinian into total panic. The plague had reached the imperial palace itself, and when absolute power found itself powerless against an invisible bacteria, Constantinople collapsed completely. The first victim inside the palace was Antonina, Empress Theodora's personal servant. One morning she was tidying the imperial apartments. By afternoon, she was vomiting blood into the marble gardens. 2 days later, she died in the arms of the most powerful woman in the world, who could do absolutely nothing to save her. Panic spread through the gilded corridors faster than the disease itself. Ministers fled the capital. Generals abandoned their posts. The Patriarch of Constantinople himself, Christianity's second-ranking religious authority, died within 3 days, leaving the city without spiritual leadership at a time when it needed it most. But do you know what truly demonstrates the desperation of the times? The absurd measures. They took the measures they took when they realized that neither wealth nor power offered protection. Theodora ordered all the palace windows sealed with wax to keep out the pestilent air. Justinian hired Persian and Arab doctors, even barbarian healers, anyone who promised a cure. They paid fortunes for blessed amulets, for potions made with mummy powder, for rituals that involved sacrificing animals in the imperial gardens. Nothing worked. The plague respected neither crowns nor crosses, and then came the most desperate moment. In December 542, Justinian himself woke with a high fever. The most powerful emperor in the world, the man who had reconquered half the Mediterranean, who had built the Regia Sophia, who dreamed of restoring Rome, was dying of a disease that killed beggars. For 3 days the empire was without a ruler. Theodora took control. But what if she too died? And if the entire dynasty were wiped out by a bacterium, who would rule half the world? Justinian survived, one of the few who did. But when he recovered, he found a completely different empire. 40% of Constantinople was gone. 40%. It was as if almost half the city had been wiped off the map. Entire neighborhoods became ghost towns. 3-story houses had only orphan children, living alone on the 3rd floor because all the adults in their families were dead. Markets that once bustled with activity had only wild dogs fighting over scraps of food. The monetary system collapsed because there were not enough people to work. Tax collections plummeted by 80%. The army that had reconquered Italy had to abandon half its territories because there were no soldiers left to defend them. But the worst was yet to come. The plague wasn't content to ravage just Constantinople. It spread like an invisible wildfire throughout the Mediterranean world, and the numbers of what happened in the next 2 years will leave you speechless. While Justinian recovered in the palace, apocalyptic reports arrived from every province of the empire. Alexandria, the city that fed half the world with its wheat, lost 2 of its population. Antioch, the commercial center of the east, became a ghost town. Thessalonica, the second largest city in the Balkans, had entire streets without a living soul. But here's what's most striking. The plague destroyed not just people, but the very fabric of civilization. Let me give you an example that demonstrates the true scale of the catastrophe. The Diocese of Alexandria controlled the entire grain supply to Constantinople, millions of tons of wheat that fed the imperial capital. When the plague arrived there, within 6 months, there weren't enough people left to even harvest the wheat, let alone load it onto ships. Constantinople began to starve while entire fields of grain rotted in Egypt. The imperial postal system, the internet of the time, simply stopped working. There were no living messengers to carry the mail. Entire cities were isolated, unsure. If the empire still existed, if Justinian was alive, if there was a functioning government anywhere. And then something happened that had never happened before in history. Enemies stopped fighting because they didn't have enough soldiers to wage war. The Persians, who had been battling Byzantium for decades over Mesopotamia, simply gave up. Not out of diplomacy, but out of a lack of men. Justinian had to abandon the reconquest of Italy. his lifelong dream, because half his army had died from the plague. The cities he had reconquered were left unprotected. Barbarians who had previously been held back by Byzantine military might realize there was no one left to guard the borders. But do you know what the darkest moment was when the final estimates of the disaster arrived? In 2 years, between 54 and 54, Justinian's plague killed between 25 and 50 million people. 50 million. To give you an idea, the total population of the Roman Empire at its peak was 60 million. The plague killed nearly as many people. It was as if half of civilized humanity had simply evaporated. The ancient world, that world of grand cities, prosperous trade, refined art, and complex philosophy, died along with these people. What was left was a poorer, more ignorant, more frightened world, a world that would take centuries to recover. And today, looking back, we can see that Justinian's plague wasn't just a disease. It was the end of an era and the first dress rehearsal for all the pandemics that would come after, including those yet to come. The similarity between what happened in 542 and what we're experiencing today is frighteningly precise and should make us deeply concerned. Think about it. Just like us today, the Byzantine Empire was hyper-connected. Trade routes linked China to England, passing through Constantinople, messengers. It was a globalized world by the standards of the time. And it was precisely this connectivity that transformed a local disease into a global pandemic. Today we have something infinitely more dangerous. Airplanes. An infected passenger can leave in the morning and be in São Paulo by night, spreading a new strain before even showing symptoms. What took months to cross the Mediterranean in the 6th century, today it takes hours to cross the planet. But do you know what the most terrifying similarity is? Arrogance. The Byzantines believed themselves protected by the most advanced medicine of the time, the highest walls, the most sophisticated organization. We believe ourselves protected by vaccines, antibiotics, and intensive care units with respirators, but the higher C. pestis, the same bacteria that killed Justinian, still exists, still kills, and is becoming resistant to our most powerful antibiotics. In 2020, cases of bubonic plague appeared in Mongolia, Madagascar, and the United States. The bacteria didn't go extinct, it was just waiting. And here's what haunts me most. We are more vulnerable today than the Byzantines were in 542. They lived in small towns, produced their own food, and had self-sufficient communities. We live in megacities of 20 million inhabitants. We depend on global supply chains. We even import our basic foodstuffs. If a new plague were to shut down global transportation for months, as happened in the 6th century, São Paulo would run out of food in 2 weeks, New York in 10 days, Tokyo in a week. COVID was just a foretaste, compared to what a new plague of Justinian could do today. COVID killed 7 million in 3 years. The original plague killed 50 million in 2 years, in a world population 20 times smaller than today's. Do the math. A plague with the same lethality today would kill 1 billion people. And do you know what's cruelest? Just like the Byzantines, we continue to ignore the signs. Deforestation is bringing humans closer to wild animals carrying new diseases. Climate change is expanding the habitat of vectors like fleas and mosquitoes. Antibiotic resistance is creating untreatable superbugs. The next plague of Justinian isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. And when it arrives, we will discover that our advanced technology, our smart cities, our global connectivity, all of which makes us feel so superior to the Byzantines, may be precisely what makes us more vulnerable than they ever were. Justinian's next plague isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and when it arrives, perhaps we'll finally understand what those people of Constantinople felt when they woke up one ordinary morning and discovered that half their neighbors had died overnight. Because ultimately, we are all citizens of Constantinople. We all live in a city that thinks itself invincible, protected by the best technology of the time, governed by the most powerful leaders in the world. We all wake up every day thinking our civilization is too solid to collapse. Our medicine is too advanced to fail. Our organized society is too organized to collapse. exactly as Justinian and Theodora thought until that September morning in 542. The difference is that they didn't know that an invisible bacterium could destroy millennia-old empires. We know. We have the historical reports, the scientific data, the mathematical models. We know exactly how a pandemic can wipe entire civilizations off the map, and yet we continue to live as if it were impossible for it to happen to us. But here's the truth no one wants to face. Every morning we wake up without a new bubonic plague making headlines is pure luck. Every day our cities function normally. Our hospitals aren't overwhelmed with the dying. Our streets aren't filled with orphans. That's a miracle that could end at any moment. The people of Constantinople enjoyed 1,000 years of imperial grandeur before 3 days of high fever ended it all. We've only had a few decades of modern medicine. Who said it will last? Justinian dreamed of reconquering Rome and restoring its past glory. In the end, he barely managed to keep his own empire afloat. Perhaps we, too, are dreaming of impossible conquests while an invisible threat is already on its way. So I ask you, are you prepared to wake up one September morning and discover that the world as we know it ceased to exist overnight? Or will you continue living as if history were just history? Because the Plague of Justinian taught us a brutal lesson. No matter how powerful we think we are, a bacterium measuring just a few microns will always be stronger than empires of millions. And it's waiting its turn. If you've made it this far, you probably feel the same way I did when I discovered that the Plague of Justinian was just the first in a series of pandemics that nearly wiped humanity off the map, and that the next one could be even worse. I spent months immersed in the accounts of Byzantine historians, archaeological studies of ghost towns, and scientific data on how this bacterium still circulates around the world today. And I discovered something that kept me awake for weeks. There are at least 6 other historical pandemics that were just as brutal, but that almost no one knows about. That's why I made this next video that's appearing on your screen about how the Black Death of 1348 made the Plague of Justinian look like child's play. And why did doctors of the time literally go crazy trying to find a cure? If you're the kind of person who wants to understand the patterns of history so the future won't catch you off guard, give this video a like. It shows me you value this kind of content that takes weeks to research and that few channels have the courage to produce. And subscribe to the channel, because I'm putting together a complete series on the pandemics that changed the world, and some of them will make you completely rethink our current situation. Comment below. After learning the story of Justinian's plague, do you think we're truly prepared for the next pandemic, or are we as naive as the Byzantines? Now click this video about the Black Death and discover why 1348 was the year Europe literally died, and how the survivors created the modern world on top of 60 million corpses. That's it.